So for our second lecture, I'd like to introduce Professor Frances Jin. Her expertise is on how the brain processes cognitive functions like decision making and also emotions. We'll focus on depression and anxiety. Uh, Professor Jin also deploys a computational approach, which is very cutting edge, which I personally am looking forward to, and I know you will find interesting. So Professor Jin, I'll pass the time to you.
Okay, great. First, I want to make sure that everyone can hear me clearly. Okay, oh, good. Awesome. Okay, so while like our colleagues are helping to set up the slides, I can, I guess, briefly introduce who I am and my pathway to where I am here as well. So I completed my undergraduate study in psychology major, after which I got admitted to a PhD in clinical psychology program. What does that mean? So basically that means I got training in both doing research in psychology and my expertise in emotion science, as well as neuroimaging, as well as at the same time seeing patients or caring for clients and patients who are suffering from mental health disorders. For example, depression, anxiety, ADHD, autism spectrum disorder, and so on and so forth. So after finishing my PhD in clinical psychology, I landed over here in University of Hong Kong. So I've been teaching and doing research since 2019 here. And based on like my observation, I've had super great students, undergraduate as well as graduate students, like super talented and passionate about science and caring for our society. And so today I would like to talk a little bit about what has accomplished basically in my lab, and many of them are facilitated or actually directly done by students in my research team. Following what Professor Benjamin Becker had said, so I'll be focusing on depression, which is a very common mental disorder. And I will also elaborate or expand on what Professor Becker had talked about in terms of specific approaches in studying these disorders. So you will see more examples of the principles and ideas Professor Becker had mentioned. Okay, so depression. It's not an unfamiliar word for you guys, I'm sure. So nowadays, we all talk about depression in the society so much. But what is really depression? So first of all, depression is marked by persistently low mood for many, many days, at least 2 weeks, and a loss of interest in things that you used to enjoy. So usually depression comes in episodes. So you see this marked change in this person's mood compared to the used to be. Okay, and then depression often comes along with other symptoms, for example, loss of sleep or have other sleep disturbances, and body weight loss or appetite change. Together with a lack of energy, you feel like lethargic. You don't want to do anything. You don't want to get out of bed in the morning. Okay, and then also comes with attention, decision making, as well as memory, cognitive functioning impairments. So that's what pathological or disorder level depression looks like. So depressive disorders are a leading cause of disease worldwide. As Professor Becker had mentioned earlier, depression, in fact, constitutes about 10% of non-fatal disease burden. So it causes a lot of economical, emotional, societal burden and impairments in our in the world. Okay, so we know that incidence of depressive disorders is not a constant throughout age. In fact, like your age range is the risk range for having the first onset, the first time you experience depression in your lifetime. So between about 11, 13 years old to the time you are 18 to 20 years old, we see this huge increase in the first onset in your lifetime of depressive episode. And more importantly, so we see that post-puberty, so during adolescence, girls are twice as likely to be diagnosed with depression than boys. A lot of factors are playing a role here. And that's one of the things we're trying to figure out why, okay, in our research. But anyway, so this means that the epidemiology data showing that females or girls are twice as likely than males to suffer from depression during adolescence make this age strata a very important like life stage for us to study what's going on in depression. Okay, so then what does depression consist of, right? Or like what is it related to? We know, as Professor Becker had talked about, so psychology or mental health is basically a consequence of so many different factors, genetic, society, family, personality, and all of that. So there have been a lot of psychosocial risk factors well known. For example, family history of relevant mental disorders, and personality. So if this is someone who has high neuroticism, there's a much higher chance for this person to suffer from depression and anxiety later in life. And a socioeconomic status, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's on one hand, we have all those psychosocial risk factors. On the other hand, we also have developmental neuroscience theories. In developmental neuroscience, okay, so we know that adolescent, like your age range, the brain is actively changing. So it's actively rewiring. And so how does this maybe partly linked to why people in adolescent suffer more acutely from depression or other emotional disturbances? Okay. So overall, currently there's a lack of understanding of the mechanisms of adolescent onset depression. So we have these theories, but we don't know how they really match into it with each other and cause the depressive behaviors and cognitions we see in real life. Okay, so today I'll be talking about a few studies done in my lab that is focusing on these brain regions that has been identified by developmental neuroscience theory to be related or heavily related to emotion processing. First, many of you heard about amygdala. The amygdala, as well as other surrounding regions, have been known to be sensitive to detect environmental changes that may be salient or maybe evoking our emotional responses. And then we have striatum. Striatum is somewhere that is related to your reward. So when you have good grade or when you have like be given a very like exciting birthday gift, so that's the part of the brain that is heavily involved, striatum. So that's reward processing. Similarly, ventral medial prefrontal cortex, as well as orbitofrontal cortex. So those are also related to emotion regulation. And in fact, these part of regions, so in the middle part of the brain and right behind our eyes, are what Professor Becker was talking about when Finnish gauge got really destroyed, right? So OFC and VMPFC. So also in the middle part of the brain is something called ACC, that's anterior cingulated cortex. That's also heavily involved in emotion regulation, conflict regulation, decision making, all of these important things. And then I'm sure you have all heard about how your prefrontal lobe is important. So overall, the prefrontal cortex is heavily important in regulating your emotions. So maybe you have heard about this, but basically the brain does not develop all in the same speed at the same time. So by the time, like in your age, right, so the emotion part of the brain has been well developed. However, the prefrontal cortex, as well as the regulation part of the brain, is still actively developing. And it will continue to develop until you are 30, around 30 years old. This is still actively developing. So maybe this, because of these active engagement in rewiring or development of the brain in these regions, and combined with a lot of psychosocial stressors like peer-related stressors, relationships, as well as your study, right? Maybe all of these combined together make what adolescents, particular age range, sensitive to depression. So now, how do we study these brain regions in depression research? These are some of the very typical or well-established tools the researchers have to study depression. So some of these tools are very good at a spatial resolution. So we can look into the brain about 1 millimeter cubic in terms of resolution or even smaller. Some other tools are more sensitive in temporal domain. We can actually monitor how your brain changes at a 10th of 20 millisecond, that range. So there are spatial and temporal high resolution tools to help us understand the brain better. So some of the tools can help us to study the structure of the brain. So DTI is one of the tools to help us study how the white matters or like the fibers in the brain are wired. Okay, And Professor Becker mentioned the functional imaging. So this is something we can study how the brain's activation when you're doing something. So that's functional imaging. And within functional imaging, not only we can study how much the brain is active, we can also study how different brain regions are connected or working together when you're doing a particular task. So that's called a functional connectivity. So how these brain regions are connected. Okay. And so these ones are obviously relatively high on spatial resolution, so we can see the brain more clearly. And then on the temporal resolution part, we can look at the brain waves. Right? You have seen all of these brain waves on like advertisement, on like TV shows, right? So these are ones, brain waves, we can study that by something called EEG. Okay, so in this EEG, they're highly sensitive to temporal, they are very high in temporal resolution. So there are different ways of studying these brain waves. One way is to look at over time how how the brain wave change, ups and downs. And then we can also use tools developed by physicists as well as engineers to decompose these signals into something we call spatial frequency data. So, and for people who are interested in electronic engineering, and this will become something exciting hopefully for you. But without going into too much of the technical details, I'm next going to show you what we have found using these tools. Okay, so in this study, this is a very basic one. So we just asked those adolescent girls to lie down in the scanner, okay, with their eyes open, just resting there. Okay, so this is called resting state functional imaging. So resting state means that you're not engaging any task. You're just simply like resting there, maybe fixating on or looking at a particular shape on the computer screen. That's it. And at that time, we scan your brain. Okay, so what can we get from that kind of resting state is what we call something default, like how your brain is wired at the default mode. Okay, so in this resting stage, we studied how the brains are connected, how the brains like during your resting are communicating with each other, how the different brain parts are communicating with each other. So using established brain maps, we can parcellate. So that means dividing the brain regions into more than 200 parts. So relatively doing slightly different things. So about 217 brain regions. And we identify those brain regions that are related to the brain, the amygdala, striatum, and PFC regions we just talked about. And then we examined, so is that the case that the brain activity and connectivity within those regions, PFC, striatum, and amygdala, are going to be related to the depression symptom severity in these girls? And so this is what we have done. So using computational methods, similar to what you have heard about in machine learning. So we're trying to identify the brain connectivities. So for example, is your amygdala connecting with your prefrontal cortex the most important? Or is your amygdala connecting with some like your visual cortex most important in predicting like the severity of depression? Okay. So basically, we find those like brain regions, we correlate, basically associate this brain region connection to whether someone has higher or lower depression symptom. And what we found is that, so basically, the brain regions indeed within the amygdala, prefrontal cortex, and striatum indeed are correlated with depression symptom severity at the time you're being scanned, as well as 18 months later. Okay. So these regions are indeed seem to be related to adolescent depression. So supporting the neurodevelopmental theory. Okay. So again, so in the first study, we've seen that, okay, so these regions and how they're connected at the resting state are related to depression. And how about their structural connectivity? So remember, like, you have functional connectivity. So how are things connected when you are like functionally? But we are also looking at anatomical structural connectivity. So one of the structural connectivity we have looked at is between this, like the middle part of your brain, this rostral cingulate cortex and amygdala. Because this connectivity has been like proposed to be related to emotion regulation. And indeed, that's what we studied. Okay, and by the way, this is one real adolescent girl's brain structure like being printed on here. So this is how we can examine the brain. And we found that impaired connectivity in these regions indeed is a neuro risk factor predicting who's gonna get depression onset over 27 months. So this means that this structural connectivity, like we found some differences in this brain structure before they even got depression. We can use this structural connectivity to predict who's gonna more likely to get depression later on over 27 months. Okay, so another thing we have done is now looking at orbitofrontal cortex, the part that the finish gauge was like got the rod was really impairing, right? So that when focusing on this particular part, and remember, as Professor Becker said, so there is brain part, then there is family history, there's all of the psychosocial factors, right, involved in psychopathology. So in this study, we're particularly interested in, so does the brain activity in this region interact with family history? So is this brain part like going to be responded to reward and losses differently for people whose parents had a depression versus the ones whose parents didn't have depression? And so the task we use is very, very simple. So on the screen, you're like basically seeing two doors showing up. All you need to do is guess behind which door there's going to be monetary win. And then the other one will be monetary loss. Very, very simple. You simply like gamble or guess. And then after you made the decision, okay, we show you, sorry, you have lost. So, or great, you have win. So it's very simple task. And we are examining how does the brain react to these monetary wins and losses. Okay. And what we found is that what is showing here, again, you don't have to try to understand these like technical terms, but what is showing here is that we found orbitofrontal cortex, so that brain region reactivity to monetary loss is related to depression, but only in the people who have a family history of depression. Okay. And this is again showing that this brain region and its connectivity with another part of the brain relatively salient to negative events are also related to depression. Okay, so basically in the previous 3 or 4 studies, we basically covered this part. So the high spatial resolution part. Next, I'm going to show you very briefly what we did with this high temporal resolution part using EEG. Okay, again, the same task is shown here. And this time we logged to this very specific time point when you are seeing the result, whether you have won or lost. So marking, focusing on this time point, we see how the brain react. Okay, so this is a brain wave. Okay, so basically for each person, if we plot how your brain reacted to monetary wins and monetary losses, those are the blue and the red lines over here. And we can plot the difference. Okay, this is something called a rupee. So rupee, which is reward positivity, means that we use your brain activation when you see the reward minus that the brain activity when you see the loss, and that's what we got. And then we plot these brainwave differences for people with later on had a depression versus the people who didn't have depression. We see a significant difference. So it turns out that people with depression respond to these brainwave to this monetary reward differently, even before they get onset of depression. Again, as we mentioned earlier, we can decompose using physicists' approach, decompose these brain waves to frequency and time domain. And over there, we see something slightly different. We see even additional information is covered, okay, in these frequency plots. Okay, what does overall we found that so if you have a blunted response to monetary reward, subtracting monetary loss, then this is a risk factor for future onset of depression. Okay, and you got a lot of information from these different components here. Okay, so the next thing we did, and actually completed by one of my undergraduate students, my first undergraduate research assistant working in that lab, who later on went to study psychology in Oxford for a PhD program. So what she have examined is that using computational tools, like what we call computational modeling. So those are mathematical tools to help you to figure out how people make decisions. Okay, so she used a relatively simple task using this mathematical tool to decompose how people make decisions and link that to the brainwave we just saw earlier on. And she found that so these brainwave can actually explain like how you are making like monetary related decisions in life. And so basically we found a brain correlate of your decision-making impairments related to depression. Okay. Okay, overall, so I hope like this give you a like very surface level taste of what it looks like to study clinical neuroscience, okay, or psychopathology using brain data. To quickly sum up, so we have studied both temporal and spatial domain. We talked about how to use the connectivity when people are at rest to study depression, and then how to study the anatomical connectivity between two regions to predict the depression. And then we studied how brain react to reward and losses is related to depression. And then for the temporal domain, we talked about how reward and loss processing, in terms of brainwave, are related to depression. And in the end, we use mathematical tools or what we call the modeling derived decision-making measures to link that to depression. Okay, so to quickly sum up, there is converging evidence supporting neural circuits involved in adolescent onset depression, supporting the developmental neuroscience theories. We know that these neural circuitries undergo like very dramatic changes during adolescence, and perhaps that's why adolescence is the time particularly sensitive to first onset depression as well as anxiety. Okay, all of these results also support the focus on emotion regulation in psychotherapy or in other types of intervention. And these findings are overall consistent with adult literature supporting that the neurodevelopmental continuity from children to adolescent to adulthood. So there are so many questions remaining to be answered. As Professor Baker mentioned earlier, this is a very, very young field. And for example, these are some really big questions we don't have answer yet. Are these depression-related neural measures changeable? Okay, if so, will they correlate changes in symptom severity? And how early can we detect meaningful and reliable neural risk factors? And I hope that we'll have some more people, young talented minds like you guys, to join us to answer these questions. Thank you for your attention. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Professor Jin. So as mentioned earlier, we will now have our Q&A. We have 10 minutes, so if anyone has questions about the lectures you just learned about, please feel free to ask. Does anyone have any questions? That's okay. Maybe you guys are too shy to ask in public. So I think it's okay to end.
Yeah, we'll stay here.
Yeah,
Yes.
we'll all stay here for a few minutes. So if you guys don't have any questions, you can please leave carefully. Please don't hurt yourselves. If you have questions, please feel free to approach any of us here and then ask us personally, okay? All right. Thank you very much for joining us here.